In the last moments before a $100 million deal sealed the fate of an empire, a waitress leaned in close to Carlo Napolitano, the notorious Mafia boss, and whispered 4 words that shattered it all. That's the wrong formula. It was a secret she wasn't supposed to know, a flaw he could never see, a catastrophe hidden behind the deal that could bring everything crashing down. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was just a waitress. But tonight, the truth she uncovered would change everything. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's go back to hours before, where it all started. The penthouse conference room was a monument to power and ambition. Perched high above the city, its sleek modern design radiated wealth and control. Whiteboards covered nearly every wall, filled with intricate math formulas, complex schematics, and projections for a venture that could shift the balance of power in the underworld. The air was thick with tension, and the light reflected off polished mahogany tables and crystal glasses, casting a dim glow on the faces of those gathered around it. At the center of this world sat Carlo Napolitano, the Mafia boss. His sharp eyes surveyed the room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. His tailored gray suit seemed to mirror the starkness of the situation, cold, calculated, and demanding respect. The $100 million deal he was about to sign would cement his place at the top of a vast criminal network, one that stretched across continents and silenced even the most powerful voices. The table was filled with figures whose names alone could strike fear into anyone who heard them. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the final touches were made. This was not just a deal. It was a declaration of dominance, a monumental shift in control. Seated at the head of the table, Carlo was already immersed in the deal's final stages, his attention fixed on the sleek, thin tablet before him. His long fingers hovered over the screen, waiting for the moment when his signature would forever change the course of his empire. Deborah Calabrese moved silently through the room. To the people at the table, she was invisible, a mere waitress, here to serve. For the last year, her life had been reduced to this: the clink of coffee cups, the shuffle of plates, the quiet hum of conversations that barely acknowledged her presence. She had once been more than this, but that life, her life, was gone, swept away by the very man whose deal now hung in the balance. Her job was simple: refills, refills, and more refills. She moved like a shadow through the room, always careful not to disturb the carefully curated atmosphere of wealth and power. No one looked at her. No one cared to. And that was exactly how she liked it. Her past, filled with promises of greatness, was nothing but a distant memory. She had left it behind, buried it with the remnants of her failed career. As Deborah approached the table, tray in hand, she could feel the weight of the room press against her. The men and women seated around the table, dressed in their expensive suits and designer clothes, looked like figures out of a distant world, one she had once belonged to, but no longer did. She held the tray carefully, her fingers gripping it with an instinctual steadiness. The coffee cups were arranged neatly, 5 in total, each one poised perfectly on the silver tray. She approached Carlo with the practiced grace of someone who had served this room more times than she cared to remember. As she leaned forward to refill Carlo's cup, her eyes caught sight of the tablet. It was a sleek piece of technology, its surface reflecting the dim light of the room, showing intricate diagrams and data streams that only those in power could truly understand. At first glance, it seemed like just another piece of corporate nonsense. But Deborah's gaze lingered, and something caught her eye: a molecular diagram embedded within the data. The structure was familiar, almost too familiar. Her breath hitched as the world around her seemed to blur into the background. The formula on the screen was one she had once worked on long ago in a lab that seemed like a lifetime away. It was her work, twisted into something unrecognizable. And the flaw, the one she had discovered years ago, the one that had cost her everything, was still there, hidden beneath layers of false data, ignored by those who thought they knew better. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The bustling sounds of the room, the quiet conversations, the clinking of silverware, everything faded. All Deborah could focus on was that tiny flaw, that microscopic serpent coiled at the heart of the formula, waiting to strike. It was a flaw that, if left unchecked, would lead to disaster. It was a catastrophe in the making, and the man who sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the world's most powerful players, was about to sign off on it. Her heart pounded in her chest. The coffee pot in her hand suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Her mind raced as she debated what to do. Her years in the scientific community had been destroyed by this man, by the theft of her research, by the lies and the betrayals. She had been pushed aside, forced to leave the world she loved. But now, with everything on the line, she had a chance to stop the disaster before it was too late. Deborah leaned in closer to Carlo, her body slightly angled as she whispered the words that would change everything. That's the wrong formula. The room went quiet. For a moment, no one moved. Carlo's sharp eyes locked onto hers, and the weight of her words sank in. His brow furrowed in disbelief. He wasn't supposed to hear this. She wasn't supposed to be here, let alone interrupt the most important deal of his life. But Deborah Calabrese was no longer the invisible waitress. She was the bearer of the truth, the one person in the room who could stop a catastrophic mistake. The eyes of the people around the table shifted from Carlo to Deborah, sensing the shift in the room's energy. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through. Deborah had broken the silence, and with it, the fragile veneer of control that had governed this moment. As Carlo slowly turned his attention back to the tablet, the weight of what Deborah had just said began to sink in. The flaw she had uncovered was real. The deal was on the verge of collapse, and the fate of millions hung in the balance. The calm before the storm had ended. Now the storm was here. Deborah's past, hidden beneath layers of silence and quiet anonymity, began to resurface. What had once been her life, her work, her ambition, was now inextricably tied to this moment. But how had she ended up here, standing at the crossroads of disaster and redemption, in the very place she had tried to forget? The answer, of course, lay in the past. The world seemed to stand still, frozen in that one moment. The low hum of voices in the room faded, leaving only the sound of Deborah's heartbeat thudding in her chest. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't expected to find herself in this position, not after everything. But now, as the room held its breath, there was no turning back. She had spoken the words, for simple words, but ones that could unravel the empire Carlo Napolitano had spent years building. That's the wrong formula. The words echoed in her ears. She had never thought she'd be in this position again, facing the man who had stolen everything from her. Years ago, she had been the one standing in this room, though back then, she had been the one presenting the research. The groundbreaking formula that was now sitting in front of Carlo was the one she had developed, the one she had put her blood, sweat, and tears into. But this wasn't the formula she had worked on. It was a corrupted version, a dangerous version that could destroy everything it touched. Deborah's eyes darted across the room, her pulse racing. Carlo Napolitano, the notorious Mafia boss, sat just a few feet away from her, his sharp eyes narrowing at her with growing suspicion. The power in the room was palpable, and Deborah, just a waitress, just a shadow in their world, was suddenly the center of it all. The moment before her words had hung in the air like a thundercloud, threatening to break the silence, and now the room was still. Carlo's eyes were locked on her, his lips pressed into a thin line as he processed what she had said. The associates around the table, the powerful figures in the room, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something had shifted, that the world they had been building so carefully was now at risk of falling apart. Deborah's heart pounded in her chest as she continued to watch Carlo. The formula on the tablet was hers, her research, her work, but twisted. She could see it immediately. A microscopic flaw hidden deep in the molecular structure, one that she had discovered years ago but had been buried, forgotten, by those who had taken her work. It was the key to a drug that was supposed to revolutionize the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases, a breakthrough that would change the medical world forever. The deal Carlo was about to sign would make him a king in the world of pharmaceuticals, a mogul whose empire could stretch across the globe. But Deborah knew, no one else knew, the true cost of this drug. The flaw in the formula was deadly. If it was allowed to move forward, it would ruin countless lives. It was an error so subtle, so microscopic, that it could easily be overlooked by anyone who didn't know the drug inside and out. And Deborah knew it. She had discovered it long ago, buried deep in the compound's chemical structure. But no one had listened to her then, and no one had cared. The world had moved on without her. Now this mistake, this tiny flaw, was about to be the catalyst for a disaster. And there she was, the waitress, standing in the middle of it, forced to act or watch everything she had worked for slip through her fingers. The tension in the room was suffocating. The men and women around the table, the powerful figures whose decisions could shift economies, were all waiting for Carlo to sign the deal, waiting for him to cement his place at the top. But now, with Deborah's words hanging in the air, everything was on the line. A single mistake, a single error, and everything they had built could come crashing down. Deborah's body was tense as she stood there, the tray still in her hands, the coffee pot forgotten. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. She hadn't meant to speak up. She hadn't meant to draw attention to herself. But the truth was undeniable. She couldn't let the deal go through, not when so many lives were at stake. And as much as she had tried to bury her past, her knowledge, her expertise, it had all come rushing back in that one moment. Carlo Napolitano's eyes were fixed on her, but for the first time, she didn't feel like an invisible figure in the room. He was no longer the powerful mafia boss at the head of the table, the man whose word could dictate the fate of nations. In that instant, he was just another man, one who had made a dangerous mistake, one that Deborah had the power to stop. Her voice was steady, despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. She had made her choice. There was no going back now. Carlo's lips tightened, his jaw setting in a rigid line. His gaze flicked down to the tablet, where the formulas still glowed on the screen. He tapped it, his fingers moving slowly, as though the weight of the situation was finally sinking in. The room was dead silent. The powerful figures around the table, the men and women who had so often controlled the world from behind closed doors, were now silent, their eyes darting between Carlo and Deborah. The moment was fragile, delicate. Everything was at stake. Carlo finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, but there was a crack in it, a hint of disbelief. "What do you mean, wrong formula?" Deborah's stomach churned. She had been expecting this moment, the moment when her past would resurface, the moment when she would have to confront the truth that had been buried for so long. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure she was ready. Still, she forced herself to speak. "That formula is mine," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. "I worked on it years ago, and the flaw you're about to sign off on, it's catastrophic. It's dangerous." The room was still, the weight of her words sinking in. Carlo's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing through her, as if he were trying to read her soul. Deborah could feel the pressure of the moment building, suffocating her. She had no idea what would happen next. Would Carlo listen? Would he dismiss her as just a waitress? Or would this be the moment when she would have to risk everything to stop the disaster from unfolding? The room was in a state of shock. Carlo's associates, who had been eagerly awaiting the deal to go through, were now staring at Deborah with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The power dynamic had shifted, and Deborah was no longer invisible. She was now at the center of the storm, the one person who held the key to stopping the disaster. Carlo, his face hardening, slowly set the tablet down on the table, his fingers still trembling slightly. He leaned back in a chair, his eyes never leaving Deborah's face. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for Carlo's next move. Deborah stood tall, despite the nerves gnawing at her insides. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't stay silent. Not now, not when so many lives were at risk. The past had come rushing back, and with it, the truth she could no longer ignore. Carlo finally broke the silence. You're telling me this is wrong? That the deal is based on a lie? Deborah nodded. Yes. And if you sign it, the consequences will be worse than you can imagine. The room held its breath, the weight of the moment settling over them. What would happen next? Deborah had no idea, but she had made her choice, and now, all she could do was wait for Carlo to decide what came next. The fate of the deal, and the lives of countless people, hung in the balance. The room was unnervingly quiet, a silence that seemed to stretch for miles. Deborah stood still, her back straight, eyes locked on Carlo Napolitano, waiting. He hadn't spoken since she'd revealed the flaw in the formula, and the seconds felt like hours. His sharp gaze was fixed on her, studying her, as if trying to decide whether she was a threat or an ally. But Deborah didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Not now. She had done everything she could to stop the deal, but she knew, deep down, that the real battle wasn't here, in this room, with the Mafia boss and his powerful associates. The real battle had been fought long before she ever set foot in this penthouse, before she was just a waitress serving coffee. The moment of discovery, the moment she had whispered those 4 words to Carlo Napolitano, had shattered everything. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for the Mafia boss and his empire, but for her as well. It forced her to face a past she had buried for far too long. The truth of that past had never truly left her, but now, standing in the midst of the high-powered world she once belonged to, it was impossible to ignore any longer. Years ago, Deborah Calabrese was not a waitress. She was one of the brightest minds in the world of pharmaceutical research, a rising star in the field of drug development. She had been at the cutting edge, working with a team that had developed a revolutionary drug, one that had the potential to change the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases. It had been her project, her life's work. Her research had been groundbreaking, the kind of work that earned grants, awards, and the admiration of peers. At the time, Deborah had been untouchable, her future a bright, shining promise of success. She had spent sleepless nights in the lab, pouring her heart and soul into the formula, determined to create something that could save lives. But she had never expected the betrayal that was coming. The day Carlo Napolitano entered her life was the day everything changed. At first, he seemed like just another figure in the background, a businessman interested in the cutting-edge research Deborah and her team were working on. He was charming, smooth, and confident, but beneath that polished exterior was a man who saw only opportunities to further his own agenda. Deborah had been naive, trusting. She had been eager to work with him, thinking that his interest in their project was genuine. But Carlo had never cared about the science. He had cared about the money, the immense wealth that could be made from a drug like the one Deborah was developing. He had seen her success as a stepping stone to his own power, and he had taken what he wanted without a second thought. It had started small, conversations about expanding the research, funding more tests, offering more resources. But gradually, Deborah had started to notice things going missing, files, research notes, even her own work. Her ideas were being presented as someone else's. The documents she had meticulously prepared were being altered and sent off for funding under someone else's name. And then, without warning, Carlo had swooped in, offering a partnership, a deal that promised to take the research to new heights. Deborah had hesitated, but the promise of her work being brought to the world was too tempting. She was too young, too naive to see the trap being set. In a matter of weeks, she found herself locked out. Carlo had taken everything, her research, her findings, and the rights to the drug. He had pushed her out of the picture entirely, presenting her work as his own, and the world had accepted it. Deborah's career, her reputation, had been destroyed. She was left with nothing, no job, no recognition, no future. The scientific community turned their back on her, and she faded into obscurity. The betrayal had been complete. Carlo Napolitano had taken what he wanted, and Deborah had been left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Deborah had spent the years after the betrayal in hiding, working menial jobs to survive. She had never planned to return to the world she had once known. The pain of the past, the humiliation, had driven her away. And yet now, standing in this room, The truth had forced its way back into her life. When she had looked at the formula on Carlo's tablet, it was like staring into a ghost of her past. The molecular diagram was a corrupted version of the work she had poured her heart into. She recognized it instantly. The same structure, the same elements, but twisted. The flaw that had been buried so carefully was still there, waiting to strike. The drug, NT-421, was meant to be a miracle, an answer to a devastating disease. But Deborah knew the truth. The formula, as it was, could never work. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was a death sentence. The flaw in the molecular structure was catastrophic. The chemical reactions, the way the drug interacted with the body systems, it was all wrong. It would cause irreversible damage to patients, leaving them worse off than before. Deborah had discovered the flaw years ago, but no one had listened to her then. She had been dismissed, discarded, forgotten. And now, here she was, facing the very man who had destroyed her, with the power to stop him in her hands. But the cost was immense. Her heart raced as she thought about the lives that would be lost if the deal went through. Could she really stop it? Could she expose the truth, even if it meant risking everything she had left? Deborah felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. Carlo's eyes were still locked on hers, his face unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with tension, before he finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "What are you talking about, Calabrese? This formula is my ticket to the top. You're telling me it's flawed?" Deborah didn't hesitate. She couldn't. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, though every part of her wanted to run. "It's wrong. And if you sign this deal, you're signing the death sentence for anyone who takes that drug." The room was still, the power dynamics shifting as Carlo processed her words. His associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that this wasn't just another routine deal. This was something much bigger, much more dangerous. Deborah's mind raced, but her voice remained calm as she continued, explaining the flaw in the formula. The years of hard work, the pain, the betrayal, it all came rushing back. This was her moment, the one she had feared and longed for in equal measure. She had a chance to stop this, to take back what had been stolen from her. But as the tension in the room reached its peak, Deborah knew that one decision would change everything. She was no longer just the waitress in the background. She was the woman who held the truth that could save or destroy them all. Deborah stood there, eyes locked on Carlo Napolitano, the Mafia boss who had once stolen her future, who had once rendered her invisible. But not now, not here. The room was still, every breath held tight in anticipation. Carlo's associates, the power players who had long since learned to bend the world to their will, watched with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Deborah's whisper had shattered the atmosphere, a moment of tension that no one could ignore. Carlo was silent, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed her words. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly, as if betraying the calm composure he had built his empire on. The Mafia boss wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by someone like her. She was just a waitress, a servant in his mind. But now, in this moment, she had disrupted everything. Carlo cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "You're telling me the formula's wrong?" His lips curled into a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "And you're who? Exactly to tell me this?" Deborah didn't flinch. Her past, her pain, everything that had led her to this moment came rushing back in an instant. She had nothing left to lose. The world had already stolen her career once. Now it was time to take it back. She wouldn't let anyone, especially him, stand in the way of the truth. "Your formula is a death sentence," Deborah said, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's a ticking time bomb, one that will hurt countless people. The structure is flawed. It was flawed when I worked on it, and it's still flawed now. If you go through with this deal, you're making a mistake no amount of money can undo." For a moment, Carlo said nothing. His eyes studied her, trying to assess whether she was bluffing. Deborah stood her ground, meeting his gaze with a confidence that shocked even her. She had no idea what would come next, but she couldn't go back. Not now. One of Carlo's associates, a man with dark hair streaked with gray, shifted in his chair, breaking the silence. What do you mean by flawed, exactly? He asked, his voice low, tinged with skepticism. You're saying this whole deal is based on a mistake? Are we to believe a waitress has somehow figured that out? A woman seated next to him, her sharp features tense with anxiety, leaned forward, her hand gripping the edge of her chair. She might be right, she said softly, glancing at Carlo. This is a lot of money on the line. If she's telling the truth, we need to be careful. Carlo's eyes flicked toward her, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room thickened as his associates exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time, they weren't entirely sure who was in control. Deborah could feel the weight of their stares, the pressure mounting as she stood in the center of the storm. Her heart raced, but she refused to let fear show. They might have power, but she had something they didn't, something she had reclaimed through years of silence, betrayal, and hard-won knowledge. She had the truth. Carlo's voice broke through the stillness, cold and commanding. You're a waitress, Calabrese. You think I'm going to listen to you? A waitress who somehow knows better than the entire pharmaceutical industry. The word stung, but Deborah didn't flinch. She had heard worse, much worse over the years. It didn't matter. What mattered was the truth. She couldn't let him get away with this. I was a scientist, Deborah said, her voice cutting through the tension. A lead researcher. I worked on this drug. This formula, the one you're about to sign off on, was stolen from me. And I'm telling you, it's not ready. It never was. A murmur ran through the room as the weight of her words sank in. Carlo's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his gaze cold and calculating. You expect me to believe that, he said, his voice a low growl. You think I don't know how this game works? You think I don't have the best people in the business vetting everything I do? Deborah's breath caught in her chest, but she pushed forward, the words coming faster now, the anger and desperation in her voice growing. No, you don't. You've surrounded yourself with yes men, with people who only tell you what you want to hear. But you haven't listened to the right people, the people who know what they're talking about. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to stop you from making a deadly mistake. Carlo was silent for a long moment, the room hanging on his every word. His associates remained still, watching, waiting to see what he would do. Deborah knew the stakes. She had no idea how this would end, but she couldn't back down. Finally, Carlo spoke, his voice cold and sharp. I don't take kindly to threats, Calabrese. You should know that by now. You're pushing your luck. Deborah didn't back down. I'm not threatening you, Carlo. I'm telling you the truth. The drug you're about to sell is a death trap, and I won't let it happen again. Not after everything I lost. Carlo's expression darkened, but there was something else there, something she hadn't expected. A flicker of recognition, of something that made him pause, if only for a moment. For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Carlo leaned back in his chair, studying Deborah with an intensity that made her feel like he was looking straight through her. His associates were silent, no longer sure who held the power in the room. The Mafia boss was no longer in complete control. Deborah had thrown a wrench into his carefully constructed world, and for the first time, he was uncertain. Do you think this is some kind of game? Carlo asked, his voice measured cold. You think you can just waltz in here and tell me what to do? No, Deborah said firmly. But I can tell you the truth, and you have to decide what to do with it. You can keep ignoring the flaw and ruin everything, or you can listen to me and stop the disaster before it happens. Carlo's gaze never wavered, but there was a flicker of something, doubt, maybe, or even fear in his eyes. For all his power, for all his control, Deborah had taken him by surprise. She had exposed his vulnerability, the one thing he couldn't control, the truth. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and for the first time, Deborah saw him as just another man. A man who had built his empire on power, intimidation, and lies. But now, in the face of the truth, he was unsure. Maybe you're right, he said, his voice soft, almost contemplative. Maybe there's something wrong with the formula. But don't think for a second that you've won. You pushed me this far. Now, I'm going to make sure I finish what I started. Carlo Napolitano was a man of action, of decisiveness. But now, for the first time in years, Deborah had made him question everything. The challenge was just beginning. She had taken the first step in exposing the flaw. But would Carlo listen to her? Or would he turn the tables and continue down the path that had already caused so much pain? Deborah had no idea how this would end. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The fate of the deal and the lives that hung in the balance were in her hands. And she wasn't going to let them fall through her fingers again. The room was thick with tension, the weight of Deborah's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud, darkening everything in its path. Carlo Napolitano, who had spent his life controlling every room he entered, now found himself at the mercy of a woman who had once been nothing more than a shadow in his world. But Deborah wasn't a shadow anymore. Not now. The stillness of the room stretched on, every second an eternity. Carlo's gaze was intense, narrowing as he stared at her, trying to make sense of the threat she had just revealed. Deborah had just told him that the miracle cure he was about to sign off on was, in fact, a death trap, a flaw so deeply embedded in the formula that it could never be corrected without starting over. It was the kind of information that could shatter everything. She had never expected him to accept the truth immediately. But she wasn't asking him to. She was asking him to listen, to pause for just a moment, and consider what was at stake. If she had any hope of stopping this deal, she needed to make them see the truth. She had to make them understand the gravity of the situation. Deborah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't let fear cloud her mind. With calm precision, she began to speak. The flaw in this formula doesn't just make the drug ineffective. It turns it into a neurotoxin. It targets the brain's central nervous system, blocking the transmission of essential signals. At first, it might appear to work, but the effects will worsen over time. This drug would cause irreversible damage, leading to paralysis, organ failure, and ultimately death. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of a lifetime of knowledge, of years spent in the labs, piecing together a puzzle that had been stolen from her. Carlo listened, his jaw tightening as he took in her words. The men and women at the table, the power brokers who had once dismissed Deborah as little more than a servant, were now listening too. Their eyes shifted nervously from Deborah to Carlo, as though the balance of power in the room was teetering on the edge of a knife. Deborah continued, her words cutting through the silence. The molecular structure is the issue. It's a design flaw in the way the drug binds to the receptors in the body. The chemical reaction it sets off is unpredictable and dangerous. It's like a bomb waiting to go off, slowly, patient by patient, dose by dose. At first, they won't notice, but eventually their bodies will begin to shut down. It's not a cure. It's a death sentence. As Deborah spoke, she could see the reactions from the people around the table. The expressions on their faces shifted from disbelief to concern. Carlo's associates, who had once held her in contempt, were now exchanging uncertain glances. It was the first crack in the facade of invincibility they had all placed around themselves. But Carlo, ever the calculating figure, still remained stone-faced. His eyes remained fixed on Deborah, his posture rigid, his mind working furiously to process everything she had said. For a moment, Deborah wondered if she had gone too far, if she had pushed him too hard, too quickly. But then, she saw something in his eyes that told her he wasn't dismissing her words entirely. There was a flicker of doubt, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. The change in the room's energy was subtle at first. The powerful men and women who had been waiting for the deal to be signed, waiting for Carlo to seal their futures with a single stroke of a pen, now seemed to shrink back, as though the weight of Deborah's words had taken up more space than they were prepared to handle. One of the women at the table, her face pale, glanced at the others nervously. "Is she right?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Can this happen? Can the drug cause death?" The question seemed to hang in the air, and for the first time, the silence that followed wasn't just one of anticipation. It was one of doubt. Carlo's associates, those who had once stood confidently behind him, now found themselves in a moment of uncertainty. They were starting to question their own judgment, questioning the deal they had thought was foolproof. For the first time since Deborah had entered the room, she wasn't just the waitress. She wasn't the invisible figure she had once been. She had become a presence in this room, a force whether they liked it or not. One of the men, a seasoned investor with salt and pepper hair, finally broke the silence. How do we know this isn't just a mistake? That she's not exaggerating? This deal has been vetted, tested. We've had the best people working on it. But the doubt had already begun to creep into his voice, and Deborah knew it wasn't just the words she had spoken. It was the truth behind them. Her expertise, her insight, had forced their world to shift. They couldn't just ignore her anymore. She wasn't asking them to believe her blindly. She was asking them to trust the science. Carlo leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his eyes narrowing as he processed the situation. The silence in the room grew heavier, the air thick with tension. Everyone, Deborah, his associates, the power brokers seated around the table, was waiting for his next move. He had never been one to hesitate, but now, in this moment, doubt lingered in the air, suffocating the room. He had built his empire on certainty, on control. Yet here was Deborah, a woman he had once dismissed as invisible, standing in front of him, armed with knowledge that could destroy everything he had worked for. Carlo's gaze flicked toward the table again. The formula still glowed on the screen, an unyielding reminder of the risk he was about to take. Deborah was right. He knew it in his gut. But could he afford to stop now? The world he controlled was built on power, money, influence, and secrecy. Stopping this deal, pulling back now, would cost him more than money. It would cost him respect, credibility. And yet, the truth she had exposed couldn't be ignored. He turned to Deborah, his voice low, measured. You expect me to believe that everything I've worked for, everything I've built, is a lie? Deborah didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. No, I'm telling you that the deal you're about to make is built on a lie. It's based on a dangerous mistake. And if you go through with it, there's no turning back. Carlo's face hardened, but beneath his composed exterior, Deborah could see the doubt still flickering in his eyes. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and that meant everything. For the first time in his life, Carlo Napolitano wasn't sure of the next step. Deborah had thrown a wrench into his plans. Now, he had to decide whether to move forward with the deal and risk everything, or listen to the one woman who had been silenced for far too long. And for the first time, Carlo wasn't sure which choice would save him. The room was still. The weight of the moment hung over them all. Deborah had done what she could. Now it was up to Carlo. Would he make the right choice? Or would he continue on the path to destruction? As the seconds dragged on, Deborah knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, this was only the beginning. The tension in the room was suffocating. The eyes of everyone were on Carlo Napolitano, waiting for him to make his decision. He hadn't said a word since Deborah had exposed the flaw in the formula, and for a brief moment, she thought that perhaps he would dismiss her, call her bluff, just like he had done to so many others. But now, the weight of the moment seemed to press down on him, forcing him to confront something deeper than the formula. Deborah wasn't just the waitress. She wasn't just the woman who had pointed out the deadly flaw in his deal. She was a part of his past, one that Carlo had long since buried. And now, that past was rising from the ashes, threatening to burn everything he had worked for. Why didn't you tell me? Carlo's voice finally broke through the silence, low and measured, but with an edge of something Deborah had never heard from him before. It was almost regret. Why didn't you tell me who you really are? Deborah's heart hammered her chest. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and anticipating for years. The moment when everything came crashing down, exposing the dark truth she had worked so hard to bury. For a brief moment, she hesitated. The years of silence, the years of hiding from the truth. Could she really face it now? Could she face him? The man who had taken everything from her? But then, Deborah took a deep breath and steadied herself. She couldn't afford to back down now, not when the stakes were so high. My name is Deborah Calabrese, she said, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of everything she had lost. I was a scientist, a lead researcher. I worked alongside your team, Carlo. I was the one who developed that formula. The one you're about to sell for $100 million. There it was. The truth that had been hidden for so long. Deborah had been the mastermind behind the drug that was now sitting at the center of this deal. But it wasn't just the formula that had been stolen from her. It was her career, her identity, and her future. Carlo's eyes widened, and for the first time since Deborah had spoken up, his expression shifted. The cold, calculating Mafia boss seemed to falter, his steely exterior cracking just slightly. He leaned back in his chair, staring at her with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. "You were the one," he whispered, almost to himself. "You were the one behind it all." Deborah nodded. "Yes, I was. And you took it from me." The room fell into a deep silence, the weight of Deborah's words hanging heavily in the air. Carlo's associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to make of this new revelation. The atmosphere in the room had changed again, and it wasn't just the tension over the flawed formula. It was the realization that Carlo Napolitano, the man who had built an empire on manipulation and control, had been hiding a darker truth all along. Deborah could see the conflict brewing in Carlo's eyes. He was a man who had always been in control, who had always pulled the strings. But now, he was faced with the consequences of his actions. The woman who had once been a brilliant scientist, a partner in his research, was now standing before him, exposing the lies he had built his empire on. "I didn't steal your research," Carlo finally said, his voice tight. You took it," Deborah interrupted, her anger rising. "You took everything. You used me, Carlo. You used my work and discarded me when it no longer suited you. You promised me that my research would go to the people who could make a difference, but instead, you sold it to the highest bidder. You took my future, and you turned it into something ugly." Carlo looked away, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. Deborah could see the guilt in his eyes, fleeting but unmistakable. For a moment, the Mafia boss was no longer the intimidating figure he had been for years. He was just a man, standing on the edge of his own downfall, confronted by the woman he had betrayed. But the bitterness in Deborah's voice hadn't waned. It couldn't. The years of pain and regret, the feeling of being powerless, of having her career and dreams ripped away from her, those wounds still ran deep. "You think you can just buy your way out of this, don't you?" she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You think that because you control everything, money, power, even people, you can control the truth. But the truth doesn't belong to you, Carlo. And it's not something you can buy." Carlo stood slowly, his towering figure casting a shadow over the room. The others watched, unsure of how to react. They had seen Carlo in every situation imaginable: billion-dollar deals, dangerous negotiations, even life-or-death situations. But this was something different. He was on the defensive. He was being confronted not by a rival or an enemy, but by a woman who had once been his ally, his colleague, someone he had betrayed. And in that moment, the power he had built his empire on seemed to slip away from him, little by little. "You think I wanted this?" Carlo's voice was softer now, a hint of frustration breaking through. "You think I wanted to destroy your career? I took your research because I thought it was the only way to make sure it got out there, to make sure it actually helped people. But you left me. You walked away, and I had to do what I had to do." Deborah's heart ached, but she refused to let him off the hook. "You didn't have to do anything. You chose to use me, to steal everything I worked for. I wasn't just a tool for your empire, Carlo. I was a person, but you didn't see that. You never did." For a long moment, Carlo was silent, his expression unreadable. Deborah waited, her chest tightening with the tension that had built between them. Would he try to justify his actions again? Would he dismiss her words as if they meant nothing? Instead, Carlo finally spoke, his voice quiet and almost apologetic. "I know I made a mistake. But this," he gestured toward the tablet with the formula, "this deal is bigger than both of us. It's not just about us anymore." Deborah shook her head. "You don't get it, do you? It was never just about you. It was about the people who are going to suffer because of your choices. And I can't let that happen." The silence in the room grew heavier. Deborah knew she had to make him see the truth, but she also knew that her battle wasn't over. Carlo was a man who had never been confronted like this, and the power he had once wielded was slipping through his fingers. But Deborah wasn't done yet. She had come too far to back down now, and as she stood there, Staring into the eyes of the man who had taken everything from her, Deborah knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the people who would suffer because of the lies he had built his empire on. And she would do whatever it took to stop him. The tension in the room was unbearable. Deborah's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of what they represented. Carlo Napolitano, the man who had been untouchable for so long, stood before her, and the floor beneath him seemed to be crumbling. But this wasn't just about the deal anymore. It wasn't even just about the money. This was something far bigger, a reckoning. Carlo's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. He could feel the room shifting, feel the authority he had built over decades slipping through his fingers. The faces around the table, once his loyal allies, now wore expressions of doubt. Some of them glanced nervously at each other, while others simply stared at Deborah as if she had turned into a different person entirely. Carlo wasn't used to this. He had built his empire with cold, calculated moves, never hesitating, always a step ahead. He had faced down countless enemies, dealt with threats in ways no one else could, and emerged victorious. But now, in the face of this woman, this waitress who had once been a part of his past, he found himself forced to confront something he had spent his whole life avoiding: the truth. Deborah stood her ground, refusing to back down. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time, Carlo wasn't in control. And that was exactly what she needed. Enough. Carlo's voice finally broke the silence, low and threatening. He straightened his posture, his massive presence attempting to reassert control. He turned to one of his bodyguards, who had been standing by the door, ready to intervene at a moment's notice. "Get her out of here," he ordered coldly, his voice heavy with authority. The bodyguard hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure about the situation. It wasn't like Carlo to hesitate, and that only added to the unease that now gripped the room. Carlo's associates, the power players who had been eager to see the deal come to fruition, now watched with uncertainty. The storm Deborah had unleashed wasn't one they had expected, and it was far from over. Deborah didn't flinch. She didn't move. "You can try," she said firmly, her voice steady, "but it won't change the fact that you're about to destroy everything." Carlo glared at her, his fingers tapping impatiently on the armrest of his chair. His usual calm demeanor was cracking, and Deborah could see it. He was trying to regain control, trying to find a way to twist the situation back into his favor. But the truth, once exposed, couldn't be erased so easily. For a moment, Carlo seemed to contemplate her words, his face still hard, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. His hand rested on the table, the tablet still in front of him. He glanced at the formula on the screen again, as if expecting it to somehow prove her wrong. But it didn't. It couldn't. The flaw was there, plain as day. The data didn't lie. Deborah took a step forward, her presence commanding the room. She had already spoken the truth, but now she would show them the reality of what was at stake. She pulled the tablet closer to her, tapping it with a confidence she didn't feel. The room watched, every eye fixed on her, as she prepared to lay it all out. "Let me show you the data," she said, her voice calm but intense. "This is the chemical compound that will be in every dose of the drug you're about to sell. This is what you're risking. Human lives, Carlo. You're risking lives for a deal that's built on a lie." She scrolled through the data, her fingers moving quickly, revealing the molecular structure that had been corrupted. The diagram was clear now, even for those who weren't scientists. The bonds in the formula were wrong. The arrangement of molecules was flawed. Deborah explained the intricate details with precision, her scientific expertise overpowering Carlo's skepticism. The room fell into silence as Deborah walked them through the consequences. She outlined the way the drug would interact with the body, how the chemical reactions would cause catastrophic damage over time, and how it would eventually lead to death. The faces around the table were no longer expressions of doubt, but ones of shock, some even repulsed by the very idea of what was at stake. Carlo's hands clenched into fists on the table, his fingers whitening as he processed the information. He had always been in control, but now, as the data unfolded before him, he was forced to reckon with the very thing he had tried to ignore. the truth. The truth that could bring his empire to its knees. "Is this real?" one of the men at the table asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and fear. Could this really happen? Deborah didn't flinch. "Yes," she replied, her voice cutting through the tension. "If you go through with this deal, it will. You'll destroy lives, Carlo. You'll be responsible for it." Carlo leaned back in his chair, his eyes dark and focused. The room was silent, every person watching him as the weight of Deborah's words sank in. For a moment, it seemed as though time had stopped. The deal that had seemed so certain, so inevitable, was now in question. And it was all because of one woman, one simple whisper. Deborah stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done what she could to stop this. She had exposed the truth, and now it was up to Carlo to decide what came next. Would he continue with the deal, risking everything for the promise of wealth and power? Or would he listen to the one person who could stop the disaster from unfolding? Carlo's gaze flicked around the room, his mind clearly working in overdrive. His empire had always been built on power, manipulation, and control. But now, he was faced with a choice that could break everything apart. He was used to deciding the fate of others, but this was different. This was a decision that would affect him, his empire, and the lives of thousands of innocent people. For the first time, Carlo's power seemed to waver. Deborah had forced him to confront something he couldn't control, something that could unravel everything he had built. Finally, Carlo spoke, his voice tight with restraint. "If I stop the deal, I lose everything. Everything I've worked for. My reputation. My control." Deborah didn't hesitate. "And if you go through with it, you lose your soul." Carlo's jaw clenched. He didn't answer right away. The room held its breath, waiting for him to make his decision. Carlo Napolitano had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. Would he choose power, or would he choose what was right? The seconds dragged on. Deborah stood there, waiting for him to make the choice. Finally, Carlo's shoulders slumped, and he sighed, his voice low but firm. "The deal is off." The room was silent for a moment. Then a ripple of disbelief spread through the group. Carlo Napolitano, the man who had never been swayed, had made the decision to stop the deal. The room seemed to exhale collectively, but for Deborah, the battle wasn't over yet. Carlo had chosen to listen to her, but the fallout from this decision was just beginning. As the tension began to ease, Deborah knew one thing for certain. She had stopped the deal, but the fight for her future had only just begun. The weight of the moment still hung in the air, thick and heavy. Carlo Napolitano, the man who had built an empire by bending the world to his will, was finally silent, contemplating the choice he had just made. His associates, once eager to see the deal sealed, were now caught in a wave of disbelief. The room had shifted. The momentum of the deal that had been set in motion was now halted. And in that silence, Deborah found herself standing at the precipice of both a personal victory and an uncertain future. Carlo's gaze was still locked on her, his expression unreadable, his mind working through the implications of the decision he had just made. It was a choice that could cost him more than just money. It could cost him everything he had fought for. Yet, there he was, forced to confront the one truth he could no longer deny. The drug was flawed, and his empire, built on lies and manipulation, was at risk of crumbling. After what seemed like an eternity, Carlo finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of frustration beneath it. "Stop the deal," he ordered, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. "Pull back from the acquisition. We're putting it on hold." The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Deborah stood still, her heart racing, unsure whether to exhale in relief or prepare for the fallout that would inevitably follow. She had made her case. She had exposed the truth. And now, Carlo was making the decision to stop the deal. But what cost? The initial shock in the room was palpable. Carlo's associates exchanged uneasy glances, their disbelief transforming into concern as they processed the magnitude of his decision. The deal that had promised to solidify their control over a massive fortune. A deal that had been in the works for months. was now being suspended indefinitely. For the first time, Carlo was not the one in control. His decision had created a ripple effect that was beyond his ability to manage. Deborah could see it in their eyes, the unease, the uncertainty. They had all expected the deal to go through, expected the money to flow, expected their futures to be secured. Now, their carefully laid plans were crumbling. The murmurs of discontent grew louder, the voices of Carlo's inner circle rising in protest. One of the men, a tall, dark-haired figure who had been seated at the table throughout the discussion, leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Carlo, you can't be serious," he said, his voice tinged with anger. "This deal is worth billions. You're going to throw all of that away because of one mistake in the formula." Another woman, her expression tight with frustration, added, "You've spent years building this empire, Carlo. This isn't the time to second-guess yourself. The world won't wait for us." Deborah could feel the weight of their words pressing down on Carlo. The decision to stop the deal had shaken them all. But Carlo didn't budge. His jaw clenched, and he looked each of them in the eye, as if daring them to challenge his authority. "This is bigger than money," he said, his voice firm. "If we go through with this deal, we'll be responsible for countless lives being ruined. And that I won't stand for." There was a moment of silence as Carlo's words hung in the air. Deborah could see the tension in his associates, the way they wrestled with his decision. It was clear that their trust in him was beginning to waver. For the first time, Carlo was facing the consequences of his actions. He had always been the one making decisions that affected others. But now, the very foundation of his empire, the one he had spent so many years building, was at risk of falling apart. Deborah felt a pang of guilt deep within her. She knew that Carlo's world was collapsing, but she also knew that it had been built on lies. He had used her, betrayed her, and now he was facing the fallout of those choices. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she couldn't deny that her actions had set this chain of events in motion. For the first time in the evening, Carlo's eyes softened as they met Deborah's. He had been the one in control for so long, but now he was forced to acknowledge something that he had never truly considered: the value of her intellect, the strength of her character, and the immense courage it had taken for her to stand up to him. "You were right," Carlo said, his voice low, almost begrudging. "The formula was wrong, and I should have listened to you sooner." Deborah felt a flicker of something, relief, perhaps, though it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that her fight wasn't over. Carlo's acknowledgement of the truth didn't erase the years of pain, betrayal, and loss. It didn't fix the damage he had caused, but it was a start. Carlo leaned back in his chair, his hands folding in front of him as he regarded Deborah. "I've spent my life making decisions to protect this empire," he said, his tone quieter now. "But I've never really thought about the cost. Not until now." Deborah stood tall, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not here to save you, Carlo. I'm here to stop the damage you're about to cause. If you want to salvage what's left of this empire, you need to make better choices. Starting now." For a moment, Carlo didn't speak. He simply stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. The power dynamic between them had shifted irreparably. He had once been the one who controlled the room, who controlled her. But now, in the wake of his decision, he was forced to confront the reality of what Deborah had exposed, the lie that had brought him to this point. Carlo exhaled slowly, his gaze softening. "You're right," he said, almost to himself. "And I'll make it right. I owe you that much." Deborah didn't know what to make of his words. She had heard promises like this before, empty words from a man who had no intention of following through. But something in Carlo's expression told her that this time, maybe it was different. As the tension in the room began to ease, Deborah knew that this was only the beginning. Stopping the deal had been the first step, but there was still a long road ahead. She had exposed the truth, but now she had to figure out how to rebuild her life, how to reclaim the career that had been stolen from her so many years ago. Carlo's empire was on the edge of collapse, and Deborah knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But she also knew that he had a choice to make: to rebuild on a foundation of truth and integrity, or to keep fighting for the empire he had built on lies. For Deborah, the fight for her future wasn't over. But at least now, she had control of the narrative. And that was a victory she could finally claim. As the room emptied, Carlo's associates lingering in quiet conversation among themselves, Deborah couldn't help but wonder what her next move would be. The truth had set her free, but the consequences of that truth were still unfolding. And now, it was up to her to decide how she would shape the next chapter of her life. Deborah stood at the window, looking out over the city below. The lights flickered in the distance, casting a dim glow over the sprawling metropolis. For a moment, it felt like everything had stopped. The chaos of the last few days, the betrayal, the decisions that had forced her to confront her past, everything seemed to come to a head in this quiet, still moment. She had done it. She had stopped the deal. She had exposed the truth, a truth that had nearly cost her everything. The formula was flawed, and Carlo Napolitano, the man who had taken her career and her future, had listened. The deal was off. Lives had been saved, but what about her life? What about the life that had been taken from her? Deborah had spent years in the shadows, a forgotten scientist pushed aside by the very man she had once trusted. She had buried her pain and her anger, hiding behind a new identity, working menial jobs to survive. But now, standing here in Carlo's penthouse, she realized that she was no longer a victim. She had reclaimed her voice, her power, and in doing so, had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. The soft chime of Carlo's voice broke her reverie. She turned around to face him. He stood near the door, his posture still commanding but less certain than it had been before. The weight of the decision he had made, the decision to stop the deal and expose the flaw in the formula, was still on him. But Deborah saw something different in his eyes now. A hint of respect, a flicker of something else, maybe even admiration. "I know this isn't what you expected," Carlo said, his voice steady, though there was a vulnerability in it that Deborah had never heard before. "But I have to admit, your expertise is invaluable. You're right. The deal was wrong. The formula was wrong. I made a mistake. But there's a way forward. We can fix this. Together." Deborah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected him to offer her anything, let alone a chance to return to the very thing that had once been her life. "You want me to help you?" she asked, her voice a little hoarse. "After everything that's happened, you want me to come back into your world and help you create a new formula?" Carlo nodded. "Yes, I want you to help me get it right. I've built an empire, but I can't do this without you. I know what I've done, and I'm not asking you to forget that. But you have the knowledge, the expertise. We can make this right. We can create something that will actually help people." The offer hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into the chaos. Deborah's mind raced. Could she really go back to this world, the world that had abandoned her, that had taken everything from her? Was it worth the risk? Was it worth the chance to rebuild her career and, more importantly, reclaim the life she had lost? Deborah looked down at the floor for a moment, considering the weight of what Carlo had said. He wasn't offering her a second chance out of guilt or charity. He was offering her a role in a new venture, a chance to rebuild something that could matter, something that could undo the damage he had caused. But could she trust him again? No, the trust would never be the same. It couldn't be. She couldn't just forget what had happened, the betrayal, the loss. But the truth was, Deborah had always been a scientist. It was in her blood. It was the only thing she had ever been truly good at. And Carlo knew that. He had taken her work and twisted it. But now, he was offering her a chance to fix it. She had made her choice once before, to walk away, to disappear. But now the world had changed. She had the power. She had the knowledge. And for the first time, it felt like she had control over her future. Deborah stood straighter, meeting Carlo's gaze. "I'll help you," she said, her voice clear and firm. "But I'll do it on my terms. You won't control this. I will. If we're going to work together, it's because I choose to. And if you think you can use me the way you did before, you're wrong." Carlo's lips tightened into a thin line, but he didn't argue. He nodded slowly. "I understand, and I won't make that mistake again." The decision had been made. Deborah had taken control of her future, reclaiming her life, her career, and her power. She had exposed the truth, stopped the deal, and now she had a chance to rebuild. It wasn't the future she had imagined, but it was a future that was hers to shape. As she stood there in Carlo's penthouse, looking out over the city that never slept, Deborah felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The battle had been hard. She had fought for her future, for her identity, and she had won. The past no longer held the power it once had. She had reclaimed her place in the world. But even as she felt the weight of the moment lift, she knew this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead. The world Carlo had built was filled with shadows, and the forces that had nearly destroyed her were still at play. But Deborah had a new sense of purpose, a new strength. She was no longer just a victim of her circumstances. She was a force in her own right, and she was ready to take on whatever came next. Her path was no longer defined by what had happened to her. It was defined by what she would make of her future. And for the first time in years, Deborah Calabrese was looking forward to what came next. The story concluded not with a single victory, but with the promise of a new journey, one that would be shaped by Deborah's own choices. She had proven that courage and truth could overcome even the most powerful adversaries, and in doing so, had reclaimed her life and career. As the city buzzed beneath her, she knew her story was far from over.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.